Hello listeners, this talk is in response to a comment that was left beneath one of my other talks. And the comment was by someone called hooha tothefla. I hope I have pronounced that correctly. And he wrote to me, I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on how Aussies in rural communities live. I had a friend that once did a working holiday in Australia for 6 months. He said he made about $18 an hour, but most of his money was spent away because of high rent. He said if he was to do it again, he would choose to live in a rural area because rent is so much cheaper, but you can still make the same amount of money. Seems odd to me though, because if you could make that much in the Outback or other rural areas where the cost of living is low, I would think everyone would be living close to a middle class lifestyle and not be that poor. So thank you for those comments and that inquiry, hoo-ha tothefla. Before I get into discussing specific points addressed or raised rather in that comment, I think I need to distinguish a couple of things. The first thing is between people who are doing a working holiday and people who live somewhere long term. So when people do a working holiday in Australia, usually they're young. I think there's an age limit of 28. I think they have to be under 28. And it's an adventure for them, and they can move on when it suits them. So if they get a bit bored with what they're doing, they can move on. And in many cases, they have to move on because they often do farm work and it's seasonal, depending upon when the fruit or vegetables are harvested. So often they're forced to move on. So that's a very different kind of lifestyle to someone who wants to live somewhere long term and have a family and so on. It's a little bit different living in the countryside if you have more commitments and so on. And that will become apparent later on in this talk. The other distinction I need to make is between what is called the Outback and what would just be called the normal countryside, because there is quite a distinction here. Australia is a really huge place. Most of it is empty desert and people don't live there. The Outback really means the middle of nowhere, a very long way from big cities or even large towns. And I'll offer a few numbers here that will really help to illustrate this. So Australia is approximately the same size as the USA, but it only has a population of 23 million people. So it's less than 1/14 of the population of the USA. And most of that population is concentrated in a band on the east coast, particularly the southeast part of Australia. And then elsewhere in the nation, there are a few other little pockets of people, but generally speaking, the population density is extremely low. I mean, imagine a country such as the USA with only about 7% of its current population spread across that nation, or really concentrated in some places. The rest of the country would be quite sparsely populated. In this regard, I think it's really only Canadians and some Americans who are from places in the West where the population density is quite low, who can really fathom what it's like in Australia in terms of population density and so on. And to further illustrate this point, Australia only has 5 cities with populations of more than 1 million people. So contrast that with the US, for instance, or with Europe. And if we look at cities with a population of more than 100,000 people, there are only 16 of those cities in all of Australia. And by the time we get to the 30th largest city, the population is only 48,000. I'm not really sure if we would even consider that a city. But you can see that it really drops off quite rapidly. The top handful of cities have an enormous number of people in them, and then elsewhere it's really sparsely populated. People often have a notion of Australia being somewhere where most people live in the bush and they have some sort of bush skills or they interact with animals and so on. It's actually not the case at all. Australia is extremely urbanized because of the landscape and the climate. So if we think about the 3 states or territories that would be considered desert states, there are some other places that have desert as well, but the 3 that are predominantly desert, Western Australia, South Australia and the Northern Territory, they account for well over 50% of the land area in Australia. And the largest settlements in order are Perth in Western Australia, that has 2 million people. Adelaide in South Australia has 1.3 million people. Then we go all the way down to 140,000 people in Darwin in the Northern Territory. And then the next one, the 4th one after that, is Bunbury in Western Australia, and that has 74,000 people. So it's very sparsely populated in what is considered the Outback. Now, I haven't even been to many of these places. I've been to Perth and Adelaide, but I haven't been to anywhere else in the 2 states in which those cities are located, and I haven't been to anywhere in the Northern Territory, including Darwin. And it takes a long time to get to these places if you don't fly. I went to Perth probably about 16 years ago now, and it took 40 hours by bus from Melbourne. And between Melbourne and Adelaide, there was some population there, and then after Adelaide, it really dropped off. We went through a few towns, but only a handful, I think. And after that, it was literally that there was just a petrol station that also sold food, and then nothing else for another 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers or more even. So it's really immense, and there's nothing there. Indeed, Perth is actually supposedly the world's most geographically isolated city. It's closer to Johannesburg in South Africa than it is to Sydney. So when we talk about the Outback and working in the Outback, we're really talking about a few things here. There actually aren't very many jobs in the Outback. During the 2000s and even into this decade, there was a resources boom, primarily because China's economy was booming. Some other places as well, but China in particular. And Australia basically couldn't provide primary goods, whether those were things you dig up, cut down, grow, whatever. Australia pretty much couldn't provide those quickly enough to China, particularly coal and iron ore. And so there were actually jobs in these in mines in many remote places in the Outback for minerals and so on. But that's drying up, or has dried up in many cases now, because China's economy has slowed down. Now, those were very particular kinds of jobs, though, and they had very particular kinds of lifestyles. They're not necessarily things backpackers could do, for instance. There were also what's called FIFO, fly-in, fly-out jobs. So you would fly in from a major city, and you'd work at the mine for 3 weeks, and often quite long shifts, and then fly out for 3 weeks, or something like that. On, off, like that. It was pretty intense. I don't know if it's possible to drive to those kinds of places. It might be, but it would be very time consuming and also dangerous in some ways, because if you get stranded in the Outback, it can be life threatening. So the kinds of people who did those fly in, fly out jobs, some of them were very smart and frugal, and they were able to save a lot of money and buy houses and so on. Others were not so clever, and they just blew it all on toys or partying. But either way, they weren't going to live in the Outback long term. It was only ever going to be something that they did to rack up a lot of cash very quickly, and then to go about their lives after that. Maybe they were only going to do it for a couple of years or 5 years or 10 years, but it's not something that most people were thinking about doing long term. And that's even more apparent now that the economic boom in China has slowed down somewhat. And there was actually a secondary effect in that a lot of these guys based themselves in Perth or Darwin, and there was a real estate boom in both of those cities. They became very expensive to live in as a result of this. But nevertheless, it wasn't something that most people considered long term, because these places are really in the middle of nowhere, and the things that they have or had at these mines were basically enough for the people who lived there, but they weren't the kinds of places that women would want to go to and raise a family and that sort of thing. And also in terms of getting those jobs, I'm not quite sure to what extent someone could just apply for a job there or just arrive and get a job. I think that wasn't that easy to do. I think someone needed to have some skills. So whether those were trade qualifications or licenses to operate various kinds of machinery, or even a degree in engineering or surveying or something like that. So again, it's not something that just anyone in Australia could do, I believe, or could have done. So in that regard, talking about working in the Outback's a little bit unusual. Generally, when we're not talking about those kinds of jobs, the Outback and people who live in the Outback long term, their lifestyle or the general conditions of the Outback, they suffer from many of the same issues that people who live closer to big cities but who still live in the countryside suffer from. And those issues are even more pronounced because the Outback communities are so far away from everything else. So, is it possible to live a middle-class lifestyle in the countryside in Australia? Yes, but not for everyone. And I think there are three main issues. The first one is to do with employment and other financial issues. The second one is to do with social services and infrastructure. And the third one is to do with cultural activities, things to do, nightlife, that kind of thing. So let's look at the employment and financial issues first. The cost of living varies depending on where you live in Australia, including between city and country areas. Accommodation is probably the thing that varies the most. If you live in the countryside, whether you rent or purchase a house, it's generally cheaper, especially the farther away you get from any large settlements. Though not always. If you live in a place that's very touristy, somewhere that has a very nice beach, that's popular with nice views and all of that kind of thing, there's some very, very expensive real estate there owned by wealthy people from cities. Or if you live in places like near ski resorts, there are actually ski resorts in Australia, those can be somewhat more expensive as well than the general trend in the countryside. But if you don't live in those kinds of places, accommodation can be a lot cheaper. It can be half the cost, a third of the cost, even cheaper than that in some quite remote places. It really depends. I mean, it's a sort of a supply and demand thing. Not that many people want to live in the countryside, particularly really remote areas, so the real estate is not very expensive there. Other things also vary. Probably the most noticeable thing is petrol. Petrol tends to be at least 10% more expensive, often significantly more than that. And basically, the farther you are from a major city, particularly a port, the more expensive it becomes because they have to transport it there by truck. And obviously, they figure the costs into how much they charge for the petrol at the pump. So petrol can be a major factor. That's fine if you don't drive very much. If you live inside a town rather than just outside a town or even some way outside a town, that's probably not too much of an issue if you just drive down to the shops a couple of times a week or drive your kids to school, that kind of thing. It's probably not really too much of a factor. But if you have to drive a lot for one reason or another, especially work, that can really add up. That increased cost of petrol can actually, at least it did when petrol was a lot more expensive, when the world oil price was more expensive, that can actually really eat into the savings you make on accommodation. Probably not entirely, but still the cost of petrol can take a fair chunk out of those savings. Other items vary. It really depends. There don't tend to be too many things that are cheaper unless they're produced locally. And you know, most areas don't produce too many things locally. So for instance, if you live in Victoria, which is in the southeast, and you buy bananas. Well, bananas are grown in the north, in Queensland. If you buy them in the city or if you buy them in the countryside, you know, chain supermarkets, I'm not sure if there's too much of a price. I imagine if anything, they're probably slightly more expensive in the countryside, because I imagine they transport them to Melbourne and then they distribute them to regional areas from there. Likewise with other capital cities in other states. So things like that, there probably won't be too much difference, or if there is, the difference will be against you if you live in the countryside. Generally, though, a lot of things are pretty much the same. More or less. The main issue you would have, more than the difference in cost, is probably the availability of certain things. You just won't be able to get certain things in smaller towns and so on, which means that you would either have to substitute them for something else, or you would have to travel to a larger town or a larger city in order to get them. And of course then that again would sort of eat into the savings you would make on accommodation. So if you live a very basic lifestyle, it's probably significantly cheaper to live in the countryside because of accommodation costs. But if you want the trappings of a middle-class lifestyle with access to all sorts of goods and services, a large variety of those, then it's probably only going to be a little cheaper. Still cheaper, I think, but not too much cheaper, depending on, you know, what your interests are and so on, than if you live in the city, in a big city. And that's because of the cost of accommodation. However, it's not that simple to just say, well, then I'll live in the countryside, because the first major obstacle is employment. It is possible to live comfortably in the countryside, but you have to have a very particular kind of job, and I'll list the sorts of things you have to do. So if you have a government job, so if you were working as a teacher, or if you were working in some sort of local council or something, you would probably be paid about this. Some of these things have a kind of standard rate across industries. Others, you might get paid almost the same, but a little bit less because you live in a cheaper place. But nevertheless, if you had some sort of government job working for the local council or as a teacher or something like that, then you could probably live comfortably in the countryside. Likewise, if you worked for a large corporation, and you had some particular kind of skill, so if you worked for a utility company or if you worked for a bank, you could probably get quite a decent salary also, and you could live comfortably. If you were to have a business that served the local community, so a mechanic or a vet, or if you had a restaurant or something like that, you could probably live comfortably also. If you had a particular kind of business that dealt with tourists, domestic or international, who are willing to spend a reasonable amount of money, then you could also live comfortably there. So things like if you provided accommodation, or you had a nice restaurant, or something to do with skiing, or a winery business, or things like that, you could probably live relatively well. Though, of course, many of those types of things tend to be seasonal. So, and they often shut down during the off season. So I'm not quite sure what those people do during the off season. So people who have businesses near the beach, near really nice holiday beaches, I'm not quite sure what they tend to do in winter, for instance. Likewise, people who are involved in the ski industry, I'm not sure what they do in summer. Some of them might do sort of hiking tours and stuff like that. But I imagine there's a lot of seasonal employment students and things like that. So there aren't necessarily jobs for people in the long term in those communities unless they can do something else during the off season. And of course, there are some farmers who can live comfortably, though not that many. It's actually, farming is a pretty difficult job actually. It's really hard work and they're often in a lot of debt. The ones who make a lot of money tend to have a lot of land, and high quality land at that can produce high quality goods, so that they can produce really fine wool or things like that. But basically, all of these kinds of jobs or businesses tend to be really hard to break into in the countryside, simply because they have very low turnover. Those people can live quite comfortable lives and they really enjoy living in those places. And they have no desire to leave. Often they work there all their lives. They work there for decades, and they only stop working there when they retire. Or if they have a business, they might own that business for decades. It might be something that their father did and passed on to them, and they might pass it on to their own children, or they sell it, but they don't do so until they're ready to retire. So there's really low turnover in these places. And also, even when there is turnover, it's often not advertised outside of the local area. They tend to the jobs tend to become available through word of mouth, except for government jobs to some extent. So it can be really difficult to break into these areas. So though one might think, oh, why not just go and work in the countryside? Because of the lower cost of living, it's not that easy to get a good job there. I lived in a small country town. It was about 3,000 people. It was a sort of both a farming community and a tourism town. And I worked there as a teacher, but I only worked as a substitute teacher there. And it was difficult to get regular work there. In fact, I had to work in another town and travel to that other town, and it was quite a long distance to travel there. So it's actually not difficult it's actually not easy to get work in those places if you just kind of turn up. Now, if you don't do those sorts of things, then what do you do in the countryside? There are lots of regional areas in Australia that used to produce primary goods. So primary industry means things you grow, cut down, or dig up, essentially. So agriculture, timber, mining, but fishing, that kind of thing. And they used to produce all sorts of things, and that's why those towns were founded. They were often founded as farming communities, or they were founded as gold mining communities, or for timber, all sorts of things, fishing communities, and so on. Or they used to also process those things. They might have had some sort of local factory or mill or something that processed those primary goods into secondary goods. But due to a combination of automation, think about the amount of work that can be done with farm machinery now, big harvesters and so on, compared to the number of people it would have required to do the same amount of work in the past. So due to a combination of automation and globalization, because many of these markets are no longer viable in Australia, it's cheaper to do these things in developing countries. A lot of these jobs have either just completely disappeared, the lumber mill has just shut down, for instance, or they have been consolidated by large corporations. So rather than being a lot of small farms, there are now just a few really big farms. And so they basically just don't need as many people to work in those industries anymore. So the jobs aren't there. And a lot of these communities have really suffered as a result. And the young people, it seems as though the young people more or less only have one of two paths. Unless they have one of those really good jobs that I mentioned earlier, they either leave and go to a big city, or they end up on welfare. And there's a big problem in many rural communities in Australia to do with intergenerational welfare. And I'll go into a little bit of detail about this. So my parents have a holiday house in a very, very small town. It's only a couple of hundred people, and about a third of the people who have houses there are like them. They own those houses as holiday houses. Then approximately another third are people who are from that general region but who have retired to that smaller town. It's really a village, I guess. And then there are another third of people who are of working age and have kids and so on, who work locally. Now, near where they live, there's a larger town that has about 15,000 people living there. And I was thinking about this. I asked my father, what do people do here? What do they do for jobs? And he said, well, a lot of them are on welfare. So let's just start sort of think through this a little bit. So there are 15,000 people. Let's say a third of them are retired in that larger country town, and then another third of them are children. It's probably actually not like that. It's probably the remaining third. It's probably bigger than that of people who are of working age. But let's just say that approximately 5,000 people in that town of 15,000 are of working age. Now, if you drive around that town and look at all of the forms of employment there, so government jobs, teachers, people who work for the local council and so on, there would be no more than 500. In fact, it's probably considerably fewer people in those kinds of jobs. And then if you were to look at all of the businesses, so there's some light industry there, but not very much really. There's some metalworks and various things places that produce some goods that aren't necessarily sold locally. But most of the people who have jobs there work either in, say, a big supermarket, a chain supermarket, or a fast food outlet, a chain fast food outlet, or they work in very small local businesses just on the shopping streets where it might be 4 people who work in that shop. Maybe there's a sort of husband-wife combo, and then they employ a couple of younger people who help them in that shop. But they're all really small shops, with only a handful of people employed in them. I imagine if you were to add up all of those people, they would be, say, 2,000 people at the most. It's probably actually less than that. So we get to a total of perhaps 2,500 people of working age who have jobs, because I can't see what else they do. There might be some other people involved in some farming locally or things like that, but probably not that many. So that's out of, say, 5,000 people of working age. What do the other 50% of the people do, the other 2,500 people? Some of them might go to some other nearer towns. Some of those places do have industry there, but not all of them, I think. What do? They're on welfare, essentially. It's very hard to get a good job in those places, in large regional towns or mid-sized regional towns in Australia. There's just nothing to do there. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, these people would have worked as farmers, or they would have worked in the local sawmill or whatever it would have been. Those jobs are all gone now. So it's not possible for those kinds of people to live a middle-class lifestyle in the countryside. And indeed, if you just hang around those places and observe people for a while, so there were a few times when I went to the supermarket with my family. My mother and my wife went elsewhere to another shop, and my father went into the supermarket to get some things, and I stayed in the car with my son because we didn't want this whole hassle of getting him out of the car seat and all this stuff. So I just stayed in the car park, just watching, and I saw massive numbers of people who seemed to be on some form of disability. They were parked in disabled spaces with stickers on their cars, and they walked with pronounced limps and this sort of stuff. I imagine there are a lot of people who get some sort of disability allowance for depression or things like that, some sort of mental illness. And then there were just large numbers of people who looked like they were really struggling financially just by their clothing and just their general demeanour, the way they sort of shuffled along and so on. So I imagine there are lots of people on welfare there, and there are lots of people who are really struggling. It's not that easy to get a good job there. It's in theory, yes, you can live a very comfortable lifestyle there, but it's not that easy for financial reasons. Some places do still have jobs. So there are some fruit canneries or abattoirs, things like that, but they don't employ that many people. And even still, a lot of businesses have moved to the capital cities to take advantage of ports and airports and things like that. So the next issue that can make it difficult to have a middle-class lifestyle in the countryside in Australia is the social services and the infrastructure. Those can really be lacking in the countryside. So the schools can be really hit and miss. I lived in a town that was quite a nice town, and the local school where I worked was nice. I mean, not many of those kids were going to go on and become Nobel laureates or things like that, but they were nice kids, and it was nice to teach there. But another school I worked at in another town near there was really bad. A lot of the kids came from broken homes. There was widespread alcohol or substance abuse, all sorts of problems with these kids and their families. And I had a number of rather interesting encounters with parents and so on. And some of the kids were pretty interesting as well. So some of the schools there can be really hit and miss. And if you want your child to go to a good school and get a good education, that's something you really need to consider if you want to live in the countryside, because you don't necessarily get good teachers, because good teachers will tend to go to good schools in the city, in each state, the major city or one of the other large cities there. You won't tend to get them at smaller schools in fairly nondescript towns. Those kinds of people just won't want to move there, both because of the nature of the job in each case, and also because of some other issues I'll discuss in a moment. And the other issue is you can end up with some pretty terrible kids in your own child's class. You know, your child's classmates can be pretty rough around the edges, and could hold your child back and so on. So that can be a limiting factor in terms of having a middle-class lifestyle in the countryside. And then there are things like hospitals, for instance. A lot of the larger towns will have fairly large hospitals also, and there'll be smaller hospitals or clinics in smaller towns. So the town in which I lived, that was about 3,000 people, and there was a very small hospital there. I mean, it had very sort of limited equipment and so on. If you needed specialists, you had to go somewhere else, basically. And often that means you have to go to a regional hub. They'll sort of designate large regional cities as having some of these things, but it can still be difficult to get really good doctors to go and work in those places. A lot of the time, if you need very particular things, you basically have to go to a large city for healthcare, for really good healthcare. That's just the nature of the beast, really. And that's true of many other kinds of services like that also. And even if you're dealing with the private sector, it can be a problem. So, for instance, I had a washing machine that was still under warranty, and it was experiencing some problems, so I contacted the service hotline or whatever it was, and of course I got some guy in India who had no idea where I lived. And he kept saying to me, "Oh, okay, all right, so how about, can you take it to this place?" And I said, "Well, I can't take it anywhere, first of all, because it won't fit in my car, and I don't want to have to drive it 2 hours, right? That's part of the warranty, that you people come and sort this out." But he kept saying, "Oh, can you take it to this place?" And I would say to him, "No, that's 2 hours away." "Or what about this place?" "No, that's an hour and a half away." "What about this place?" "No, that's 2 hours away also." And it was a real hassle getting this sorted out. Eventually someone came out to my house, because they have sort of authorized mechanics and so on. They must have contacted someone who lived near me who wasn't normally one of their authorized mechanics, and they sent him out and he came and fixed it and so on. But that kind of thing can be a real hassle. And if you want to go shopping and buy particular goods, it can be a real hassle finding places that sell the particular things you want. Now that's changing to some extent with the internet and internet shopping, though there are still large delivery fees involved. But basically, if you want to do certain things, buy certain things, or go and use certain services, then you're going to have to rely upon driving. So you'll need a car, and you'll probably have to spend a fair bit of money driving. And yeah, I had a friend whose father was sick, and my friend lived in the city, and yeah, that's right. His parents had to eventually sell their house because they needed. Partly was because of medical reasons, but the costs and so on involved. But also there wasn't the right kind of healthcare nearby, so they had to actually sell up and move somewhere else completely. And it was a real hassle for my friend to go out and visit them and all of this sort of stuff. So that can be another limiting factor in having a middle class lifestyle in Australia in the countryside. And the third factor is cultural activities, and by this I'm talking about a sort of a broad collection of things here. So if you have hobbies that are not very common, you probably won't find them in most country towns. There'll be certain sporting clubs. I mean, they all have a football club of one description or another, whether that's Australian rules football or rugby. I mean, a lot of the top footballers in Australia come from the countryside because there's nothing else to do, right? So they get really good at football. They probably have a soccer club for kids, tennis courts, basketball courts, maybe a swimming pool, though not necessarily, maybe a golf course, though not necessarily, netball, a few other things, cricket, of course. But if you're into something else, you may or may not be able to find it there. So I don't know, if you're into badminton or something, maybe you could rent a court at the local youth centre or something and bring your own badminton equipment or something. I don't know, but that kind of thing. Or if you have some other hobby that's not that common, that doesn't sort of revolve around country living, I don't know, woodworking or fishing or something like that, then you won't necessarily find people in those kinds of places who are into those things. So it can, that can be a difficult adjustment, that people who are used to being able to do whatever they want, to have access to all sorts of interesting things around them in big cities, when they arrive in these places, they might find that they can no longer do those hobbies, or they're very difficult to maintain unless they want to travel a lot to do them. Likewise, things like restaurants are often very limited in number and style. If you go to a lot of country towns, they sort of have some sort of local pub cuisine, kind of broadly Australian English kind of food. They might have one Italian place, maybe one Chinese place, and that's it. So if you want to get all sorts of other fancy stuff, then you're not going to be able to get that there, unless it's a really sort of high-end tourist town. And often the quality can be a bit lacking in some of those places. I've been to some very good restaurants or very nice sort of cafes and so on in country towns, but I've also been to some that have been not so good because they just don't have that much competition, obviously. Likewise, things like cinemas. Some towns have their own cinemas, but many don't. And that's not such a problem these days with the internet and so on. But it can be a problem. I mean, if you want to go and see the latest action flick on a huge screen with surround sound and so on, then you might have some problems there. You might have to travel a fair way to go and see those kinds of things. Likewise with museums or galleries or music venues. Bands generally don't play in these places. You have to travel to go and see bands and so on. So your ability to access these kinds of things that middle class people are frequently interested in is limited. It's limited to very sort of typical country type activities, playing football, horse riding, I don't know, that kind of thing, woodworking and so on. They do have some small local festivals, and there are some country towns that have developed kind of a scene. They might have a really big music festival that lasts multiple days, but many of these places don't have those kinds of things, or their local festivals are really small, and they might only have one or two a year. They might have some sort of weekend market, but the thing about country weekend markets is you see the same people selling the same stuff every week. I mean, people go there for kind of a social thing, but you're not going to see anything new at those markets, really. So if you want to have a middle class lifestyle, it is possible, but you have to adapt, or you have to be interested in certain things, or become interested in them if you want to be happy in the countryside, and that's fine, but it's not for everyone, obviously. as I said, there are some places that have a particular scene. They've developed a kind of an art scene there, something like that, for instance. Or if you're really into surfing or something, there are some places that have that, or boating or something like that. But most of them have a pretty standard selection of things that I've already mentioned. And then there are a lot of country towns that are really depressing to go to. They don't have anything. They are depressed and depressing places. And they're sort of cultural wastelands full of people on welfare who just sit at home all day and they do nothing, or they get up to mischief, basically. Those places are not the kinds of places where you can have a middle-class lifestyle at all. So these three sets of issues, employment and financial issues, limited social services and infrastructure, and cultural activities, mean that the good country towns can be inaccessible, usually for the economic reasons, basically finding a good job there, or they require a significant change in lifestyle. But many places are not the kinds of places where that's even possible, often for multiple reasons. So it's very much easier said than done. And a lot of people who do live middle-class lifestyles, they've been there a long time. And frequently they've been there before those places were often like that. They've been there, or they've moved there. They moved there very early on when a particular scene was developing or something like that, or they've lived there all their lives essentially, or they tend to be retirees basically who don't want a really sort of active lifestyle anyway. So it's a lot easier said than done. So thank you for your comment and inquiry, hoo-ha to the fla. I hope this has gone some way to answering this. And actually, I'm really glad that you posed this question to me, because a lot of the things that are sort of posed to me and other people on the alt-right are the usual kinds of questions, and I don't mind answering those usual kinds of questions, but it's nice to get something on quite a different type of topic every so often. So thank you again, and to everyone else, thank you for listening.